The Atlantic Ocean in June 1942 was a graveyard of merchant ships. But on the night of the 13th, the horror took a mechanical, sentient form. 500 yards off the coast of Amagansett, Long Island, the sea began to boil as the salt-stained hull of the U-202, a Type VIC German submarine commanded by Captain Lieutenant Hans Lindner, breached the surface like a prehistoric predator. Inside the cramped, diesel-fumed belly of the Iron Wolf, 4 men, George Dasch, Ernst Berger, Heinrich Heinck, and Richard Quirin, prepared for a mission that the high command of the Abwehr believed would bring the American industrial machine to its knees. These were the graduates of the Quens Lake Sabotage School, trained for months in the dark arts of chemistry, circuit breaking, and silent killing. They were not merely soldiers, they were Operation Pastorius, a spearhead designed to shatter the American spirit through calculated terror. As the hatch swung open, the biting Atlantic air rushed in, mixing with the stench of oil and sweat. Dasch, the team leader, stepped onto the wet deck wearing a full German Marine uniform, a calculated legal shield, for the laws of war dictated that a man caught in uniform was a prisoner, while a man in civilian clothes was a spy fit for the gallows. They lowered an inflatable rubber boat into the churning surf, loaded with heavy crates marked as medical supplies, but packed with enough TNT, pen-sized detonators, and incendiary devices to level the aluminum plants of the Ohio River Valley. As they rowed through the thick spectral fog toward the silhouette of the dunes, the sound of the surf masked the rhythmic splashing of their oars, marking the first time since the Revolutionary War that an organized enemy force had successfully invaded the American mainland. The transition from soldiers of the Reich to invisible ghosts began the moment their boots hit the soft, freezing sand of New York. The 4 men worked with frantic, hushed efficiency, dragging the heavy crates into a hollow between the dunes. Under the shroud of the midnight mist, they stripped off their Feldgrau uniforms, shivering in the raw wind, and donned the cheap, off-the-rack American suits they had purchased in Berlin. This was the ritual of transformation, the burial of their identity. They dug deep into the sand, interring their German hats, their tunics, and the lethal crates of explosives, intending to return for the ordnance once they had vanished into the urban labyrinth of Manhattan. However, the silence was suddenly shattered by a beam of light cutting through the fog. John Cullen, a 21-year-old, unarmed Coast Guard apprentice, had stumbled upon the scene while on his nightly 6-mile patrol. The tension was a physical weight. Dasch's hand moved toward the hidden weight of a pistol, and his teammates tensed to lunge. But in a move that baffled his comrades and would later confuse the highest levels of the FBI, Dasch didn't kill the boy. Instead, he stepped into the light, claiming to be a stranded fisherman, and when Cullen's suspicion didn't waver, Dasch shoved a wad of crumpled bills into the boy's hand, $260 of Nazi bribe money, and hissed a chilling command. "Look me in the eye and forget you ever saw us." Cullen took the money and retreated into the fog, seemingly cowed. But the unexpected twist wasn't just the bribe, it was Dasch's internal state. As he watched the boy disappear, he realized he hadn't just bought a few minutes of silence, he'd left a witness who knew their faces. And as the 4 saboteurs walked toward the Amagansett train station, blending into the early morning commute of unsuspecting New Yorkers, George Dasch carried a secret even more dangerous than the TNT they left in the sand. The invasion had begun, but the leader of the Nazis' greatest sabotage plot was already planning his betrayal. John Cullen's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird as he sprinted through the heavy, salt-laden air of the Amagansett shoreline. Behind him lay the fog-drenched dunes where 4 men, shadows in cheap suits, were burying the secrets of the Third Reich. In his pocket, the $260 in crumpled American bills felt like a searing brand. It was more money than a Coast Guard apprentice saw in 6 months, a bribe intended to buy his soul and his silence. George Dasch had miscalculated. He had gambled that a young, isolated sailor would choose greed over duty. But as Cullen reached the safety of the Amagansett Coast Guard station, gasping for breath, he didn't head for his bunk. He burst into the station house, awakening his superiors with a frantic report of German voices, a beached submarine, and the strange, desperate man who had shoved a fortune into his hand. Within minutes, the station was a hive of controlled chaos. Armed with rifles and flashlights, a squad of Coast Guardsmen returned to the spot Cullen described. They found the surf empty and the fog impenetrable. But as the sun began to bleed over the Atlantic horizon, the sand gave up its dead secrets. Digging where Cullen had seen the shadows moving, the sailors unearthed 4 heavy, waterproof crates. Inside, cushioned by wood shavings, were the instruments of a nationwide massacre. Blocks of TNT disguised as coal, complicated timing devices, and incendiary pens. The realization chilled the men to the bone. The war hadn't just come to their shores, it was already walking among them, headed for the heart of the American industry. While the military scrambled to secure the beach, the saboteurs were already miles away, experiencing the surreal transition from invaders to commuters. George Dasch and his team had reached the Amagansett train station just as the first morning light hit the rails. They looked like any other group of businessmen or laborers heading into the city for a Saturday shift, but beneath their suits, they carried the cold sweat of men who knew they were being hunted. On the train to Jamaica, Queens, Dasch sat staring out the window, watching the American landscape fly by, the very bridges and factories he was ordered to destroy. His partner, Ernst Berger, sat across from him, his eyes scanning the carriage for any sign of a uniform. Berger was a hard man, a former member of the Nazi Party who had spent time in a concentration camp for ideological deviance before being recruited for this mission. He was a man with no love for the Gestapo, yet he was bound to the plot by the threat of death. The tension between the two was a silent electricity. As they changed trains and finally ascended from the depths of Pennsylvania Station into the roaring, sunlit chaos of Midtown, the sheer scale of New York hit them. Millions of people, thousands of police officers, and an endless grid of steel and concrete. They checked into the Hotel Governor Clinton, just blocks from the FBI's New York field office. The unexpected twist, however, lay in the briefcase Dasch clutched to his chest. While the FBI began a frantic secret search of every hotel in the city based on Cullen's description, they didn't know that the leader of the cell was currently sitting in room 1401, not priming a bomb, but staring at the telephone with a trembling hand, preparing to commit the ultimate act of treason against the Führer, to save his own skin. The serene, mirror-like surface of Quenz Lake, just west of Berlin, betrayed nothing of the malice brewed within the walls of the requisitioned estate on its shores. In April 1942, months before the Long Island landing, George Dasch and his recruits were subjected to a grueling, high-pressure curriculum under the watchful eyes of Obver experts. This was the Sabotage School, a clandestine laboratory of chaos where the art of destruction was treated with Prussian precision. The men were not selected for their ideological purity, but for their intimate knowledge of the United States. Most had lived, worked, or married in America during the 1920s and 30s. At Quenz Lake, they were taught to re-identify their former homes not as sanctuaries, but as a collection of structural vulnerabilities. They spent weeks hunched over blueprints of the Pennsylvania Railroad, the Hell Gate Bridge, and the massive hydroelectric dams of the Tennessee Valley Authority. Instructors demonstrated how a single well-placed charge on a transformer or a crucial rail switch could cause a cascading failure of the American war effort. They practiced the coal trick, hollowing out real lumps of anthracite and filling them with high explosives to be shoveled into the furnaces of troop ships. The atmosphere was one of calculated desperation. The Obver knew that the tide of war was shifting, and Operation Pastorius was envisioned as a surgical strike to paralyze the American giant from within, turning its own industrial might into a weapon of self-destruction. The psychological conditioning at Quenz Lake was as vital as the chemical training, yet it was here that the cracks in the mission's foundation began to spiderweb. While the younger recruits, like Quirin and Heineck, were easily swayed by the promise of glory and the threat of the Gestapo, the dynamic between George Dasch and Ernst Berger was a simmering powder keg of resentment. Dasch, a man of soaring ego and shifting loyalties, often clashed with the instructors, resenting the rigid military structure. Berger, conversely, was a man already broken and rebuilt by the Reich. Having survived the horrors of a concentration camp for his past political errors, he viewed the mission with a cold, hollow cynicism. One evening, during a private walk along the lake's perimeter, the two men had a whispered conversation that would ultimately seal the fate of the entire network. Away from the hidden microphones of the estate, Dasch expressed his disgust with the Nazi regime and his secret desire to return to the America he truly missed. Berger, instead of reporting Dasch to the political officers, remained silent, a silence that signaled a terrifyingly unexpected alliance. The twist was that the Obver, so meticulous in teaching the men how to assemble a timer or brew a corrosive acid, had failed to notice that their two lead saboteurs were bonding over a shared hatred of their masters. As the group toasted to the destruction of the New World during their final graduation dinner, Dasch and Berger were already mentally rehearsing a different script, one that involved a briefcase of cash and a complete betrayal of the German Reich. Manhattan, in mid-June 1942, was a city vibrating with wartime energy, oblivious to the fact that 4 saboteurs were embedded in its heart. George Dasch and Ernst Berger sat in the oppressive silence of room 1401 at the Hotel Governor Clinton, the air thick with the smell of cheap tobacco and the hum of the city 14 floors below. The transition from the foggy dunes of Amagansett to the luxury of midtown had been seamless, yet for Dasch, the pressure was becoming a physical weight. While the other 2 team members, Heineck and Quirin, were out exploring the city like wide-eyed tourists, Dasch was staring at the black rotary telephone on the bedside table. He knew that the FBI, alerted by the young Coast Guardsman John Cullen, was likely already scouring the city's ports and transit hubs. The briefcase containing nearly $84,000 in Nazi operational funds sat on the bed, a fortune meant to buy explosives and bribes, but which Dasch now saw as his ransom. In a moment of chilling clarity, Dasch turned to Berger and laid his cards on the table. He wasn't just stalling, he was going to surrender. Berger, the man who had survived the concentration camps, didn't reach for his throat. Instead, he leaned back and exhaled a cloud of smoke, his silence confirming the secret pact they had forged at Quenn's Lake. The mission was dead. Now it was a race to see who could betray the Reich first. With Berger's silent blessing, Dasch finally reached for the receiver. His first call was to the New York field office of the FBI. The conversation was a surreal exercise in bureaucratic disbelief. Dasch, speaking in his fluent, slightly accented English, identified himself as a German agent who had just landed via U-boat and demanded to speak to J. Edgar Hoover. The agent on the other end, accustomed to wartime cranks and paranoid spy-seers, didn't even take notes, eventually hanging up on what he assumed was a delusional prankster. Undeterred and fueled by a manic ego, Dasch waited a few days, even playing pinochle with his unsuspecting teammates to maintain the facade of the mission. Finally, on June 18th, he told Berger he was going to Washington, D.C. to finish what he started. The unexpected twist came when he arrived at the Capitol. Dasch didn't skulk through back alleys. He walked through the front doors of the Department of Justice, carrying the briefcase of cash. He demanded to be heard, but even then the federal agents treated him with mockery until he opened the bag and dumped thousands of dollars in sequential bills onto a desk. The laughter in the room died instantly.
As the FBI agents stared at the Nazi gold, the telephone ghost finally became a terrifying reality. Dasch had not only surrendered, he had handed the FBI the roadmap to every sleeper cell and explosive cache on the East Coast, effectively signing the death warrants of the men he had shared a submarine with just days before.
The atrocities inside the FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. on June 19, 1942, shifted from bureaucratic boredom to high-voltage shock in the span of a heartbeat. George Dasch, the man who had been ignored by the New York field office, now sat in a sterile interrogation room, flanked by stone-faced agents who finally realized the magnitude of the man before them. To prove his identity, Dasch took his leather briefcase and inverted it over a mahogany table. A literal mountain of American currency, over $80,000 in crisp sequential bills, cascaded out, a sight so surreal it silenced the room. This was the blood money of the Abwehr, intended to fund a year of terror, now serving as Dasch's ticket to a hoped-for hero's welcome. For the next 13 hours, Dasch became a fountain of intelligence. He didn't just confess, he performed. He provided the exact coordinates of the Long Island burial site, the secret ink formulas hidden in his luggage, and the detailed blueprints of their primary targets, the aluminum plants in Alcoa, Tennessee, and the crucial railway bridges of the Chesapeake and Ohio. He painted a picture of a German intelligence machine that was far more advanced than the FBI had feared, but also far more vulnerable, because it had placed its trust in a man who valued his own survival over the glory of the Reich. While Dasch spoke, the FBI's technical laboratory scrambled to verify his claims, leading to the most critical revelation of the entire interrogation. Dasch revealed that the invasion was not a single-point strike. It was a pincer movement. He exposed the existence of the second sabotage team, Edward Curling, Werner Thiel, Hermann Neubauer, and Herbert Haupt, who had landed via the U-584 on the beaches of Ponte Vedra, Florida, just 4 days after his own arrival. He gave the FBI their aliases, their prearranged meeting points in Cincinnati and Chicago, and the emergency contact addresses they used to communicate with Berlin. The interrogators, led by Assistant Director D.M. Ladd, were stunned by the surgical precision of the Nazi plan, which aimed to sever the American electrical grid and halt the production of bombers. However, the unexpected twist came at the end of the marathon session. Dasch, believing he had secured his status as an indispensable ally, asked when he could expect his formal commendation and a meeting with J. Edgar Hoover to discuss his future in American counterintelligence. He was blissfully unaware that Hoover, furious that a Nazi spy had successfully reached the capital unnoticed, was already planning to erase Dasch's contribution from the public record. The FBI wasn't looking for a partner. They were looking for a way to turn a massive security failure into a triumph of investigative brilliance, and George Dasch was nothing more than a loose thread they intended to clip.
The FBI's response to George Dasch's confession was not a loud public alarm, but a silent, suffocating blanket thrown over the entire United States. Edgar Hoover, realizing that a public announcement would tip off the second team of saboteurs and expose the FBI's initial incompetence, ordered a total media blackout. This was the birth of the invisible manhunt. Working from the detailed map provided by Dasch, federal agents moved with surgical stealth. In New York, Ernst Berger was taken into custody without a single shot fired. He was found waiting in his hotel room, almost relieved to see the badges. Simultaneously, the focus shifted to the Florida group. While Edward Curling and his team believed they were blending perfectly into the Midwest, Hoover's agents were already monitoring their every move through intercepted telegrams and local surveillance. The Florida team had split up, moving towards Cincinnati and Chicago to establish contact with German-American sympathizers. They were living in high-end hotels, spending Nazi cash on fine clothes and expensive meals, completely unaware that the waiters and bellhops serving them were often undercover FBI operatives. By June 27, 1942, barely 2 weeks after the first landing, the last of the 8 saboteurs, Herbert Haupt, was cornered in Chicago. The efficiency was staggering. The largest sabotage network ever landed on American soil had been dismantled before a single fuse could be lit. The psychological atmosphere of the final arrests was thick with the irony of failed loyalties. In Chicago, the capture of Herbert Haupt was particularly devastating. He had returned to his family home, and his parents were arrested alongside him for harboring a spy, a move intended to send a brutal message to any other potential sleeper agents. One by one, the men were funneled into secret holding cells, their identities kept hidden even from the local police. They were interrogated in shifts, their stories cross-referenced against the massive confession Dasch had provided in Washington. However, the unexpected twist was the sheer silence from the White House. While the public remained blissfully unaware of the invasion, President Franklin Roosevelt was privately livid. He realized that the standard legal system, with its public trials and lengthy appeals, would be a disaster for national security and morale. Hoover, seeking to reclaim the narrative, presented the arrests as a masterclass in FBI detective work, conveniently omitting that the entire network had been handed to them on a silver platter by the team leader. As the 8 men were finally reunited in captivity, they looked at one another with a mixture of confusion and growing dread. They were not being treated as prisoners of war, but as something far more dangerous. The invisible net had closed, and the men were about to be pulled into a legal shadow zone from which most would never emerge.
The trial of the Nazi saboteurs, which commenced on July 8, 1942, was an anomaly in the history of American jurisprudence, designed to bypass the transparency of civilian courts. President Franklin D. Roosevelt, utilizing his powers as Commander-in-Chief, issued Executive Order 2561, creating a 7-member military commission, a move not seen since the trial of the Lincoln conspirators. The venue was the ultra-secure Room 5235 on the 5th floor of the Department of Justice building in Washington, D.C., where the windows were painted black and thick curtains were drawn to prevent any glimpse of the proceedings from the street. The 8 men, Dasch, Berger, Quirin, Heinck, Curling, Thiel, Neubauer, and Haupt, were led into the room under heavy military escort, their faces pale from weeks of isolation. The prosecution, led by Attorney General Francis Biddle, argued that by discarding their uniforms and landing with explosives, the men had forfeited the protections of the Geneva Convention and were unlawful combatants. For George Dasch, this was the moment his grand delusion began to crumble. He sat at the defense table, expectant and arrogant, fully believing that his 13-hour confession and the $84,000 he handed over would be presented as a heroic act of salvation. Instead, he watched in mounting horror as the military prosecutors treated him with the same cold, lethal contempt as the men he had betrayed. To the commission, Dasch was not a hero. He was a failed invader whose confession was merely a tactical maneuver to avoid the noose. The atmosphere in the blacked-out room was suffocatingly formal, a stark contrast to the chaotic violence the men had intended to unleash. For 3 weeks, the commission heard testimony from Coast Guardsman John Cullen and the FBI agents who had processed the mountain of explosives and secret ink kits. The defense attorneys appointed by the military struggled to argue that the men had no real intention of carrying out the sabotage, but the sheer volume of TNT and the detailed target lists for the American rail system made such claims ring hollow.
The psychological breaking point occurred when Ernst Berger, under cross-examination, admitted that the group had been trained to kill anyone who interfered with their mission. This admission sealed their fate. On August 3, 1942, the commission reached its verdict in total secrecy. All 8 men were found guilty of espionage and conspiracy and were sentenced to death by electrocution. The unexpected twist, however, was the reaction of the president. While the commission recommended death for everyone, including the cooperative Dasch and Berger, Roosevelt held the ultimate power of clemency. Dasch sat in his cell in the District of Columbia jail, clutching a Bible and waiting for a sign that his deal with the FBI would be honored. He was unaware that J. Edgar Hoover was actively lobbying the president to execute all 8 men, to ensure the FBI's detective work remained the only narrative the public would ever hear. The man who saved the American industrial heartland was now just a political liability, waiting for the current to be switched on.
The humid dawn of August 8, 1942, brought a grim finality to the District of Columbia jail. In a windowless room on the first floor, the American government prepared to carry out the largest mass execution for espionage in its history. One by one, 6 of the 8 men, Edward Curling, Heinrich Hank, Richard Quirine, Werner Thiel, Hermann Neubauer, and the young Herbert Haupt were led to the electric chair. The procedure was swift and clinical. Within a span of just over an hour, the 6 saboteurs who had remained loyal to their mission were pronounced dead. However, the heavy oak door of the execution chamber did not open for George Dasch or Ernst Berger. At the very last moment, President Roosevelt had reviewed the secret trial transcripts and acknowledged that without Dasch's frantic confession and Berger's silent cooperation, the FBI would still be chasing shadows while American factories burned. Roosevelt commuted their sentences, life in prison for Berger and 30 years for Dasch. While the American public, finally briefed on the thwarted invasion, screamed for the blood of all 8 spies, Dasch sat in his cell listening to the silence that followed the hum of the electric chair. He was alive, but the hero's welcome he had hallucinated during his 13-hour interrogation was dead. He had traded the lives of his comrades for a prison number, and the FBI, led by an image-conscious J. Edgar Hoover, made sure that Dasch's role as the whistleblower was buried deep in the classified vaults. The war ended in 1945, but for George Dasch, the true imprisonment began after his release. In 1948, President Harry Truman granted executive clemency to the 2 remaining saboteurs, but it came with a devastating condition: immediate and permanent deportation to a shattered post-war Germany. Dasch returned to a homeland that viewed him with a hatred more visceral than any he had faced in America. To the Germans, he was the verräter, the traitor who had sent 6 of his own men to the chair. To the Americans, he remained a Nazi spy who had simply gotten lucky. Dasch spent the final 4 decades of his life in a desperate, obsessive crusade to clear his name. He published a book, 8 Spies Against America, and wrote thousands of letters to American officials pleading for the right to return to the country he claimed he had tried to save. He died in 1992, an impoverished and bitter man in Ludwigshafen, still clutching the yellowed newspaper clippings of his invasion. The unexpected twist of his legacy is that history eventually verified his claims. Declassified FBI files later confirmed that Dasch had indeed intended to betray the mission from the moment he touched the sand at Amagansett.